I would like to go over these 11 models of collective intelligence corporations. And I'm getting this list from the Collective Intelligence Project. The numbers you see in that table are actually their ratings of how ready to go is each of these models. And I have a couple of other videos in this series explaining what is collective intelligence, why do we need to think about funding artificial intelligence for the purpose of collective intelligence. And I'll have some follow-up videos going into more detail on some of these. But this video is just a quick and dirty overview of each of these. And quick framing for all of these, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we fund collective intelligence in a way that could eventually lead to a version of artificial intelligence that serves the population's interests better, that is democratically accountable in some way. And also, as we do this, as we move towards something that's healthier for society, how do we make sure that powerful interests can't come in and hijack that endeavor for their own interests, to set up the rules of the game for themselves? What funding model will serve that purpose the best? Oh, and the framework that I'm using to think about this is that we have this institutional ecosystem. And I'm even imagining like an ecosystem of single-celled organisms that eventually evolved into multi-celled organisms. Like in my head, this is a very biological analogy. So we've got DNA here. But the organisms in this institutional ecosystem are corporations, small startup firms, regulatory bodies in the government, information bodies that are privately owned that perhaps hold these institutions accountable through rating systems or journalism or whatever. These are all institutions. The DNA of each institution partially is made up of sort of the constitution of the institution or its mission or its organizational structure, all of that. But I won't go too much into that right now. And then over here we have a model of the corporation, because a lot of these models for funding are going to map to some degree onto this model, where we have the shareholders who purchase shares. And when they purchase shares, there's really two things they get the rights to. One is that they get the rights to the profit from that company. So if there's 10,000 shares, then they get 1/10,000th of the revenue or the profit every year that's distributed back to shareholders. That's their first right. And then their second right is to vote on the board of directors that holds the organization accountable to their interests, the shareholder interests. And they're just saving for their retirement, so their interest is for this corporation to make as much money as possible. The board of directors, their whole job is accountability for the CEO and the whole company to the shareholders. And then the CEO is in charge of management, obviously. So a lot of what we're thinking about here is what is the accountability system going back to the money. And we also need to keep in mind that those two rights of the shareholder could be separated. Like you could give the rights to vote on a board of directors to someone who didn't purchase a share. Or you could give the rights to the money to someone who doesn't actually have the rights to vote on the board of directors. So a lot of what we're thinking about is how do we restructure the contracts that make up our current system. And those contracts I am thinking of as part of the DNA of the institutional ecosystem. All right, so let me start with the initial coin offering, or the ICO. And this can actually map directly onto the corporate model, although there's going to be a lot of different variations. And the basic idea here with ICOs is that the contract that gives you the rights to the profit and the rights to governance voting is just on a blockchain. And so when a company starts up, instead of going to the classic financial markets, it could just issue its own shares and it could hand those out for free to its friends, the ownership in the company. It could sell those on a market just like in classic financial markets. But the rights, this little contract that says you have the right to do these two things, it's just on a blockchain. That's basically what an initial coin offering is. Now, I'm not going to fully explain blockchain technology here, but you can think of it as a public computer that is immutable. And so if you write a contract onto that blockchain, everybody knows that person number 56792 is the person who owns the rights that go along with that share in the company. Now, one issue with ICOs that we've had so far in the crypto world is that there's tons of sort of scams, like companies that are fake or are not very well managed, and they put out their coins. The coins are sort of what we call these shares in the company, and the people who buy them lose a lot of money. It's just a scam. Like, you can use this structure for pyramid scheme-like things. You can use this structure for all kinds of nefarious purposes. The ICO and the coins that go along with it, those are just tools. And the system hasn't yet fully developed mechanisms of accountability to uphold some of these systems. So that's something to keep in mind. That's probably partly why the score on ICOs for how ready is it for use is only a 7, it's not a 9, because there's been a lot of experimentation in the ICO space, and not all of it has panned out in a way that we fully trust, or in a way that many people would fully trust. It's also worth noting that we may not necessarily know who owns the shares. So if some really rich player or some really rich government came in and bought up a whole bunch of these shares initially, we might not necessarily know that that was happening. So you can do this without people knowing who owns the shares. But I'm not going to get into benefits and risks. That's not for this video. I'm just describing how these work. Our next model here is going to be traditional forms of crowdfunding. And this includes Patreon and Kickstarter, where some of these models are just ways that the general public can give their money to causes that they believe in. And then, of course, the Kickstarter model actually has a little bit extra in terms of algorithmic protection, because you can donate to a cause where you give it $100 or $200, but if there's not enough money to actually make that cause work out, then you get your money back. So that kind of protects the population against donating to causes that don't have enough traction to take off. So it just helps people use their money more efficiently when they pick projects to donate to. And with both Kickstarter and Patreon, we see situations where there are certain rights that are granted to people who give money. Like with Patreon, you might get the right to earlier access to somebody's videos, or perhaps the right to a t-shirt or first pass at going to a concert that somebody has when they're coming to your town. There are different types of rights that you can assign people if they donate money to you through a crowdfunding system. And the same is true with Kickstarter. Oftentimes with Kickstarter, some of the rights will be if you donate money to the cause, and if the cause creates some product, like a video game or a documentary, then you get to be in the first group of people who test out that documentary when it's still in the initial phases and when it can still evolve. So there's almost the possibility of building governance rights into a crowdfunding kind of model. Now, when I'm thinking of a crowdfunding model, I think about the institutional ecosystem, because what determines whether an organization grows and gains traction and power in this ecosystem is oftentimes how much money is invested into it. So the crowdfunding mechanisms give the crowds a way of helping out causes and public goods that they find would be beneficial to themselves. And of course, if something is not beneficial to enough people who have the power to donate, then it's going to shrink and die out in the system. But of course, one of the problems here, of course, with inequality over power over money is that people over here, and this isn't just people, this is also institutions and countries and whatnot, they have a lot of power to have an outsized say in terms of which organizations become big and powerful in this ecosystem. And of course, I say it's an ecosystem because there are relationships between these different organizations. And so investing in one of these organizations can actually influence the entire nature of the ecosystem. The next two models I'd like to look at, I'm going to classify under stakeholder ownership because they have some similarities between them. And these are worker and stakeholder equity and cooperatives. With worker and stakeholder equity, it's basically the shareholder model, except instead of these shareholders being purchased on the market, they're given out to people who are certain types of stakeholders. And you could actually have a model where these people can buy them, but you have to be a certain type of stakeholder to buy them. So the classic example in my head for this is if YouTube decided that the people who would own YouTube are the content creators, where maybe the content creators have to purchase their shares, but you have to sort of prove that you have a YouTube channel or whatnot to purchase them. Or maybe just everyone who's a content creator above a certain size would get some of these shares, and therefore they would have the rights to both vote on the board and also to make the income generated by YouTube. And of course, you can have multiple different types of stakeholders. So maybe 40% of these shares go to content creators and 60% go to users of the platform, where the users actually have ownership in this way. So the idea is the stakeholders actually care about the quality of the community. The content creators care about making sure the community can sustain them financially, as many of them are small business owners, that kind of thing. So the whole institution is accountable to the people most deeply affected by it. Now, of course, there's going to be all kinds of issues when it comes to defining who has those stakeholder rights. Like if you have content creators as one of the groups, what if someone just wanted to have influence over the system and just generated a whole bunch of really quick, crappy videos that didn't really have any potential? They're not even there to try to have potential. They're there to sort of fake somebody's status as a content creator. Like, how do you deal with things like that? So defining stakeholder is a bit of an issue here. And then cooperatives basically get rid of the shareholders, and instead, basically the group of employees or the group of stakeholders, whoever they are, they have the role of the board of directors, or sometimes even the role of the CEO. But I think of it more like the board of directors. An example of this is that I used to live down the street from a pizza shop cooperative. And the workers of that pizza shop owned the pizza shop, and they made all of the decisions about what days would they be open, what type of pizza would they have, what were the prices, what were the wages, what were the workers' rights. All of that was made collectively by the workers of the pizza shop. And when you consider that example, you realize this is not going to work unless there are really robust systems of governance. And with the pizza shop, of course, maybe there aren't enough workers for that governance problem to be that difficult because they have a little pizza shop worker community among themselves. They know each other's personalities. They know how to make decisions when things get complicated or when things get contentious. They can kind of smooth over the contention among themselves, all of that. But if you're trying to use the same model for an organization, running governance with larger and larger groups gets more and more complicated. So you might imagine the YouTube example. Like, what if the content creators owned YouTube and had to make decisions as a board of directors collectively together, where they're voting on what are the community guidelines and what are the pay rates, and all of these things they're voting on to have direct input into the system. Now, both of these models have been tried extensively for years, so we do have a sense for their strengths and weaknesses and what makes them work. The next two models I'm going to look at, I'm going to classify as nonprofit style models. And the first of these is just the traditional nonprofit, where it actually acts somewhat like a corporation, except that it has a pro-social mission. So instead of giving its profits back to the shareholders, you can go ahead and get rid of those, you channel the profit into the pro-social mission. Now, I'm an economist, and the way economists oftentimes model nonprofit behavior is that they maximize profit just like any for-profit firm, but then they channel that profit into something that has more of a pro-social cause. So if you think of not-for-profit hospitals and for-profit hospitals, they both charge money to patients. They both deal with insurance in ways that are very similar to each other. It's just the for-profit hospitals channel their money to the shareholders. The not-for-profit hospitals have some mission, which might be medical research, it might be serving the health of the local community. There's lots of different missions that these nonprofits can have, and that's where their extra money goes. So if one of the things you're worried about with corporations is that they'll have these externalities that they don't fully consider when they're maximizing their profit, there is some chance that a nonprofit will actually make that same mistake, that it won't fully account for its externalities because it's trying to maximize something that is its own goal. So that's just something to consider when we're thinking about nonprofits. And foundation ownership is actually fairly similar to nonprofits, but it brings in philanthropy so that you might have philanthropic groups that are sort of collaborating, that have a relationship, that are funding back and forth between the two groups. The next category of organization is the Perpetual Purpose Trust. And I almost classified this with the other two, the not-for-profit and the foundation ownership model, but I think it has some interesting features that warrant its own category here. And the idea is that there's this trust that buys up the shares and moves them into this more pro-social organization. And one of the neat things about this is the flexibility it has to sort of let corporations start out as regular corporations, but then if a corporation started to gain steam, you could actually purchase up those shares and move those shares into a trust where the governance of the trust was some kind of pro-social group. Now, of course, you can start out with all of the shares inside this trust if you want to from the beginning, but the fact that you can do it along the way allows for a group of people who is watching the landscape of artificial intelligence, watching the landscape of potential collective intelligence groups, and noticing when is the moment when we can actually afford to buy up a corporation that's gained some steam, and how much would that investment be? How do we do that on regular markets? So the idea is that the accountability passes from people who just want to maximize their retirement savings into a group that has some other mission to perhaps hold the organization accountable in a different way. Now, my next two models I'm going to clump together because these both involve stipulations on the shares that people buy when they first invest in a company. And this is my picture of a share of a company. It's just a piece of paper that says you own 1/10,000th of the company. And maybe it also has some clause down here that says you have the rights to vote on the board of directors. And of course, when companies initially sell their company, they basically put a bunch of these out there. They put 10,000 of these out there on the market. They sell them. And the money they make from selling these is the money that funds the company initially. With these next two models, we're just going to add some extra text onto this share that we're going to sell on the market. And with the capped returns model, the extra stipulation is going to say you have the rights to receive the stream of profits up to some amount. So let's just say up to $1 million. You get the first $1 million of revenue stream that comes through the profits of this company being distributed to the shareholders. And after that, there's a clause that says this passes into the hands of some kind of pro-social trust, or perhaps back into the hands of the pro-social organization that started out with this mission. So like, what exactly is the organization it passes back into after the initial amount of money that you've purchased? Well, that's something that you could structure in different ways. But I kind of think of this as almost a time limit on this share, where eventually this share will move into a different model that's not a corporate model. And people might not be willing to pay as much if we add the stipulation as they would if their ownership of the share went infinitely into the future. But they would be willing to pay something, especially if they had a lot of trust that this organization had the version of artificial intelligence that would win that race. So they could still sell these things with the stipulation on the market to raise money. Now, the next one is the windfall distribution model. And the way I'm going to explain this is when you issue the shares of the company, it basically says this company has committed to donating X amount of its profits to some pro-social cause, which could be a trust, it could be a cause that is specified by the organization up front. But when you buy this, you kind of know, okay, this isn't just a regular corporation. This is a corporation that has obligations to pay out a lot of the shares to some particular cause. And once again, even with that stipulation, people might be willing to buy some of this. And of course, the details that are sort of written in the fine print of how this works, those could matter a lot. You notice that with both of these models, they're not yet well tested in the real institutional ecosystem. We don't know exactly what stipulations might be necessary to make them work. So there is some risk with these models just because they haven't been extensively tried in the wild. Now, my next model here is the B Corp certification, or the benefit corporation. And there's a range of models that go along with this. I mean, the simplest and weakest, I would say, is just a regular corporation with regular shares declares itself to be pro-social. So what is the accountability mechanism for that pro-social behavior? Well, actually, you could build accountability mechanisms on top of that. The organization could be transparent about the accountability mechanisms to its pro-social mission, but it could also just claim it's pro-social when that's kind of a veneer. With B Corp certifications, this involves sort of external groups evaluating a company and issuing a certification saying, we as external auditors believe they're actually doing a good job at the pro-social thing that they've said they're doing, even though it's a classic model with regular shareholders and all of that. And you might imagine that the certification process could influence shareholders, where some shareholders would want to invest in something that they believed would not destroy the future with artificial intelligence, but would bring the whole population into the fold in terms of identifying negative externalities of AI and all of that. And the last model here is exit to community. The basic idea here is that startups oftentimes build a business in its initial stages where you need creative people doing their thing and you need to bring these ideas into being. But oftentimes startups intend to eventually sell to a corporation. With exit to community, these startups would have a different plan moving forward, such that instead of selling their organization to a bigger corporation, they would imagine once they gain steam in this ecosystem, they would have some way of passing ownership of the company into a community of some sort. And that could look like a stakeholder ownership model. Like, what exactly is the format of passing the ownership of the company into a community of people? Well, I think that hasn't fully been fleshed out to my knowledge, but the general idea is that these organizations can start out with part of their constitution and part of their mission that plans to move away from the startup initially, even though the startup may get money and may even distribute money in ways that startups normally do. But they just have some plan for the long run for this evolution of the firm that will basically change the ownership shape and the ownership structure of what they're doing. Those are the 11 models identified so far. I will put links below to some other videos I'm doing that are related to this topic